When I last left off, we were talking about the end of presidential reconstruction. Presidential reconstruction ends when Andrew Johnson, the Democratic president, decides to have a showdown with Congress, and he loses that showdown. He campaigns for Democratic or at least anti-Republican candidates in the 1866 congressional election in this famous swing around the circle. The swing around the circle is a disaster. If he was trying to campaign for candidates or help or hurt certain candidates, clearly the candidates he hurt were the ones he campaigned on behalf of. So with that, we have the end of presidential reconstruction and the onset of radical or congressional reconstruction. Now you've seen this map probably in the last two or three times already. I've shown it on slides, and now this map will make sense because when Congress takes over Reconstruction, it starts some of the policies anew. Congress was frustrated that in 1866 that they had passed the Civil Rights Bill that Johnson had vetoed. They extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson had vetoed that. These former Confederates had come to sit in Congress. They denied them their seats. So what the radicals, or what Congress does in 1867, is sets new terms for Reconstruction. What it does, it divides the South into 5 military districts, as you can see on this map, and it says that these states will not be readmitted, and technically their congressional delegations will not be readmitted to Congress until they satisfied certain conditions. First and foremost of those is they had to write a new state convention that had to, they already had to accept the 13th Amendment, they'll have to accept the 14th Amendment, which I'll go into detail here in a second, and do this with including African American voting rights. Not necessarily the 15th Amendment, that had not been proposed, but these are these new constitutions, new state constitutions have to allow for African American suffrage, African American voting rights. Why did they ask for African American voting rights? Well, of course, the cynical would say, well, these Republicans in Congress recognize that African Americans will be Republican because of this, because they've granted them voting rights. Now, it often comes as a surprise. You often see it in political debates today, the idea that African Americans were Republicans first, that African Americans voted for the party of Lincoln. And African Americans do indeed vote for the party of Lincoln from the 1870s, probably at least till the 1930s or 40s. Franklin Roosevelt sort of changes this coalition and moves this coalition away. But in the South, probably African Americans are Republicans up until the 1960s or 1970s. And that's when you see the coalition break apart there. But back to Reconstruction, what you see here on this map now, the dates begin to make sense. The dates at the top, so let's say for Florida, June 1868, that's when Florida is readmitted to the Union with a new constitution allowing for African American suffrage. So Louisiana, June 1868, Texas, not till 1870. If you notice, Tennessee is not included in this map. Tennessee had already adopted African American suffrage, so Tennessee is the one Confederate state that does not participate in this military reconstruction. So it's admitted back to the Union in 1866 and stays within the Union. Now, as I said, one of the terms was the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment has really 4 parts, one of which we remember today. First of those is the idea of national citizenship. All persons born in or naturalized in the United States, subject to jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States. We talk about 14th Amendment rights a lot today, and really a lot for the next century after the war. People are talking about, we discuss unfinished revolution. The revolution, one might argue, finishes when the 14th Amendment is actually enforced. One of the things to note in that first section is that it said that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. For 100 years, this allowed restaurants, hotels, other private entities to discriminate. But really, with the Civil Rights Movement, we begin to apply the 14th Amendment broadly, not just to states themselves. The second provision of the 14th Amendment, often forgotten, is that if states do disenfranchise, do not allow certain segments of the population these rights, that Congress can take away some of their representatives. They never use this, but theoretically, it could have been used probably a lot of times during the period from 1877 to the 1960s. You also have the idea here that former Confederate officials who had previously taken an oath to the United States were not allowed to hold any office here, essentially. Now, they really stipulated if you had taken an oath to the United States before. So if you were just a guy in Georgia who happened to be a general of the Confederate Army, you were okay. But if you had been a U.S. soldier and taken an oath to the United States, or you had served in other positions, member of Congress, for example, and taken an oath to the United States, well, you lose your political rights. Although, as it says here, 2/3 of each house may remove that disability, may restore those political rights. And lastly, it voided the Confederate debt. This might seem to be a no-brainer, but think about it. If you're a Southerner and you maintain that Lincoln said secession was impossible, that Georgia was always Georgia, or whatever else it's going to be, well, in that case, well, then why shouldn't the federal government, why shouldn't these state governments be obligated to pay those debts? But this repudiates the Confederate debt, a debt fought to fight a war against the United States. Again, it kind of makes sense to repudiate this debt. Shortly thereafter, so these coalitions will be elected. African American suffrage will be allowed to participate in this state constitutional convention. So the 14th Amendment's in 1866. The 15th Amendment will indeed become again in 1870, and this establishes voting rights. A couple key points to this. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied by the United States in any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, you can't say just because you were a former slave, you can't vote. What's interesting to note, there's no, that doesn't say gender, it doesn't say sex here. There were some people who talked about this was the idea at the time to get women's suffrage as well. That is debated, but struck down at this point. And in fact, the women's suffrage movement little divides on this. Should they support African American suffrage if it doesn't include women's suffrage at this time period? Another thing to note here is this is applied, and really for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments altogether. One of the, again, reasons we talk about this maybe as the Second American Revolution, this period of Reconstruction. If you look at a lot of the amendments early on, particularly the first to the 10th Amendments, they talk about things the government can't do. The government can't abridge your right of freedom of speech. The government in the 10th Amendment, if there are no powers specifically given to the federal government, they are reserved to the states. Here now you see really a change in the federal government. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment allow the federal government to do things. The federal government's going to guarantee that slavery doesn't exist. The federal government's going to talk about the idea of national citizenship. The federal government's going to protect your right to vote. So now you have the federal government sort of interceding on behalf of citizens, almost interceding between them and their state governments. So now we're not having a government that's restricted power. These amendments are granting the government power. And I think you really see in the civil rights and the Civil War era a transformation from really a states' rights to a national government. I mean, not that you don't hear people talking about states' rights still today, but realistically, I think there are a couple ways you can express this. One is these amendments that give these rights, but also I think most of you think of yourselves probably as an American who lives in Florida or wherever you happen to live at this point. American who goes to school at least virtually in the state of Florida. But realistically, before the Civil War, you were probably a Floridian who then, by virtue of being a Floridian, became a citizen of the United States. And think about this. So this 14th Amendment that we talked about, this idea of national citizenship, is really a new idea. It really was you were a state citizen, and because you were a citizen of New York or Florida or Georgia or Virginia, you were a U.S. citizen. Another way of looking at this nationalization is a couple things. When you see the word United States prior to the Civil War, sometimes you see United States with a lowercase u and a capital S, emphasizing the states. And sometimes you actually saw it written as a singular, and it's going to sound odd to your ears, but, as a plural. So we say the United States is a great country. But prior to the Civil War, people might say the United States are, because they're emphasizing states. States are plural, so plural should have a plural verb after it. We would never say it. It would be really grating to our ears to have somebody, if I kept saying the United States are a wonderful place to visit. Well, you think about it, states are plural, and so really you see this transformation, I think you could capture in that one verb, of how you move from a plural United States to a singular United States. And so again, this is showing the federal government's power in the lives increasing during this era. Another way the Congress struck back in congressional Reconstruction was the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And it's a failed impeachment. But what they do is they sort of set Johnson up. They passed two pieces of legislation, the Tenure of Office Act and the Command of the Army Act. That's really designed to limit the executive power. The Tenure of Office Act says, and we have this part of this today, and part of it exists all along, when the president appoints a member of the cabinet, that the Senate advises and consents. Really doesn't ever advise anymore, but consents. It approves somebody's appointment to the cabinet. It approves a lot of appointments. Well, essentially what the Tenure of Office Act said, it was going to work in reverse. If the president wanted to remove a member of their cabinet, they needed to have Senate consent as well. In particular, this was designed to protect the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was a fan of the Republicans. Republicans were fans of him. They wanted him to stay in office. And so the idea is with the Tenure of Office Act, Johnson couldn't just remove Stanton from office without getting the Senate's consent. Similarly, the Commander of the Army Act made sure that while the president was commander-in-chief, in fact, they removed him from that position because it said all of his orders had to go through the commander of the Army, who was Ulysses S. Grant, and Grant had to approve all those orders. Effectively, they made Grant the commander-in-chief of the Army. Johnson violates these. They're probably unconstitutional laws to begin with. Johnson is impeached. The House does pass several articles of impeachment, almost all of them based on these violations of these laws. It goes to the Senate. So the House impeaches, the Senate has to convict. The Senate votes 36-19 in favor of conviction. If you're sitting at home and you're thinking, well, that means he was convicted and removed from office, that's not the case. To be convicted in the Senate, you needed to have 2/3 of the senators vote to convict. So if it's a 36-19 vote, it effectively is one vote short of conviction. Johnson remains in office, but he's really cut off at the knees. He's really not powerful after this. And in fact, when we think about the presidents of the late 19th century, and when you think about a Hayes and a Cleveland and all these presidents, Chester Arthur, James Garfield, presidents you never hear of, part of the reason you don't hear about it is because what this does is it tips the balance of power in favor of Congress. And so you have really Congress really running the country for the next 30 or 40 years, sort of as a result of this conflict with Andrew Johnson. So it sort of gives you a sense of how Congress takes power and what Congress does. In my next little mini lecture, we're going to look a little bit about how congressional policy worked in the South. Thanks.